Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Tonight, we journey deep into the heart of Texas, a land where legends are as wide as the plains and twice as dark. From haunted highways to whispers carried on the wind, these are the stories that keep night shift workers looking over their shoulders and questioning the shadows around them. You're about to hear 5 true Texas night shift horror tales that blur the line between reality and nightmare. But before we begin, there's a warning. Most folks make one fatal mistake. They watch, they listen, and then they leave without subscribing. By doing that, they close the door on the darkest stories, the ones that chill you to the bone and haunt your dreams long after the screen goes black. Don't be one of them. Smash that subscribe button now, because out here in the dead hours when the world sleeps, the real terror is just waking up. Where are you watching from? What time is it on your clock? Drop it in the comments, because wherever you are, the night is alive, and the horrors you're about to hear are waiting. Now, pull the darkness closer, and let's begin. 5 true Texas night shift horror stories that won't let you sleep. Mark had been working the night shift at the truck stop just off I-40 for nearly 3 years. The place was a grim little oasis for weary truckers and restless souls, open 24/7 like some stubborn mirage in the endless West Texas flatlands. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting an eerie glow over cracked concrete and rusted gas pumps. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with a sickly yellow cast, and the stale smell of diesel mixed with old coffee clung to the air. It was a place where time seemed to stop and the lonely hours dragged on like a slow-moving storm. Mark was a small man, wiry and quick, with tired eyes that had seen too much and a cigarette perpetually hanging from his mouth like a lifeline. He wasn't much for company and preferred the silence between the occasional customers, punctuated only by the distant roar of 18-wheelers and the crackle of the old radio behind the counter. Most nights were boring as hell until the figure started appearing. At first, Mark thought he was losing his mind. It began subtly, a shadow flickering in the corner of his vision, something tall standing just out of reach near the gas pumps. The man was impossibly thin, almost skeletal, always wearing a threadbare black coat that seemed soaked in darkness. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a battered bowler hat, dipped low so Mark could never see his eyes clearly. The man never moved, never spoke, just stood there, watching. No one else saw him. Drivers laughed and joked, oblivious to the strange cold that seemed to seep from the spot where the figure stood. Radios inside the truck stop would hiss and buzz with static every time the man appeared. Trucks that had been running fine suddenly sputtered and died, engines cutting out as if someone had flipped a switch. The air grew cold, sharp and biting like a winter chill in the heart of July. Mark started calling the figure the Phantom. Nights when the Phantom appeared were the worst. Mark would find his hands trembling, his breath visible in the freezing air despite the Texas summer heat outside. The feeling was suffocating, like something unseen was pressing down on his chest, squeezing the warmth out of the world. One night, after a long string of these encounters, Mark decided he couldn't take it anymore. He gripped his flashlight tightly and stepped outside. The parking lot was empty, bathed in pale moonlight that made the shadows stretch long and dark across the cracked asphalt. There was the Phantom, standing silent and still, waiting near the pumps like a hunter in the dark. Mark's throat went dry, but he forced himself to move forward, shining the flashlight directly at the figure. The man didn't flinch or turn, but the air grew colder, so cold Mark's teeth started to chatter. Then, slow as a nightmare, the Phantom began to walk away. His footsteps made no sound, but the cold followed, like a shadow made flesh. Mark followed, heart hammering. He saw the man slip between trucks, disappearing like smoke through a crack in the fence. Mark shone his light on the ground where the phantom had been standing, and froze. The asphalt was scorched black, as if burned by fire. The footprints glowed faintly, like embers smoldering in the night. Mark dropped his flashlight and ran back inside, breathless and shaking. He called in sick the next day, and the day after that. He never went back to that job. But the truck stop kept going. Truckers still whispered stories about the black-coated man who haunted the gas pumps. Some said he was a ghost of a long-dead hitchhiker. Others whispered about old curses tied to the land. They all agreed on one thing. The phantom wasn't just a shadow. He was something darker, waiting in the night for the next lost soul who dared to cross his path. Years later, Mark swore he still saw the figure in his dreams, always standing there, always watching. Sometimes, when the wind howled just right, he thought he could hear the crackle of static, the low hum of dead engines, and the slow, cold footsteps of the phantom closing in. Jesse's world was wide and empty, a stretch of West Texas ranch land that rolled on for miles like a forgotten dream, the kind of place where the sky swallowed the horizon, and the only company at night was the wind itself, whispering secrets no one alive wanted to hear. He had taken the job because it paid well, and after years of city noise and crowded rooms, the thought of quiet was almost a relief. Just him, the stars, and the ranch. At first, the silence was a balm. Jesse would walk the fences, rifle slung low, scanning the dark fields for stray cattle or curious coyotes. The wind hummed through the dry grass, shaking the brittle leaves of mesquite trees like ghosts brushing past. Nights were cold, but they were manageable. Then came the eyes. It started one late evening when Jesse was finishing his rounds. His flashlight flickered as he passed a thick patch of brush near the eastern fence line. That's when he saw them. Two hollow eyes burning, with an unnatural red glow, staring at him from the darkness. Jesse froze, every muscle tensing like a trapped animal. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just burned, fixed on him like twin coals glowing in a blackened hearth. He raised his rifle and fired. The echo shattered the night, but the eyes didn't flee. Instead, they blinked once, slow and deliberate, like a sinister promise. Then they vanished. After that night, Jesse's nights turned from quiet to haunted. He started hearing whispers on the wind, soft, indistinct, like voices barely carried across the dry air. Sometimes the voices sounded like children, giggling or crying. Other times, they were low growls or something that might have been a voice, but too twisted and broken to understand. He told himself it was his mind playing tricks, or the wind weaving stories to keep him company. But then came the marks. Jesse woke one morning with bruises wrapping his forearms, like cold fingers had squeezed tight while he slept. The purple welts were shaped like hands, fingers digging deep under his skin. He told himself it was stress, or maybe a stray branch caught him during the night. But the marks kept appearing, growing darker and more painful. Every time Jesse saw the hollow eyes, the marks would be there the next day. Proof, he feared, that the thing watching him wasn't just a trick of light. His sleep grew restless. Dreams turned to nightmares, filled with endless black plains and eyes that stared without mercy. In his dreams, the eyes followed him, blinking slowly, always waiting. Sometimes the cold hands would reach out from the shadows to drag him down into a darkness deeper than death. One night, the ranch fell silent. Too silent. The usual hum of insects, the rustling brush, even the distant call of a coyote stopped. Jesse's flashlight flickered wildly, casting long, twitching shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then the eyes appeared again, closer than ever, shining from the edge of the brush like twin fires in the night. Jesse raised his rifle and fired into the darkness, but the bullets found only air. The eyes blinked once more, slow and mocking, and Jesse felt the cold grip of those invisible fingers curl around his wrist. He yanked his arm free, stumbling back, heart pounding like a hammer. He ran through the cold night, the brush scraping his jacket and the wind shrieking in his ears. Behind him, the hollow eyes didn't follow, but Jesse knew they were there, watching, waiting for him to stop, waiting to drag him back into the darkness. Months later, Jesse left the ranch. He didn't tell anyone why. He just packed his bags, left the lonely plains behind, and never looked back. But even now, when the wind is right and the night is thick with shadows, Jesse feels those eyes watching, waiting to catch another lost soul who wanders too far from the safety of the light. Out in West Texas, the hollow eyes still burn in the brush, silent and hungry, never blinking, always waiting. Sandra had been working the night shift at the old warehouse on the edge of downtown Dallas for 6 months, but every night felt like stepping into a different world, one where time stretched thin and reality began to fray at the edges. The warehouse was a place abandoned by light and hope. Its walls were cracked concrete, stained with years of neglect, rust creeping like veins through the steel skeleton. The smell of old oil, dust, and something faintly sour hung in the stale air. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting uneven shadows that danced just out of reach. The silence between the noises was worse than the noises themselves. Sandra liked the job well enough, despite the isolation. She was practical, no stranger to tough work, moving crates, checking shipments, taking inventory. The quiet hours gave her plenty of time to think, and that was both a blessing and a curse. At first, the warehouse was just a building. Then came the sounds. Soft, almost imperceptible at first. A faint murmur that could have been the wind, or rats scurrying. But after a few weeks, the whispers began to shape themselves into words. "Help me. Don't leave me here." At first, Sandra tried to ignore it, told herself it was nothing but her mind twisting from too many lonely hours and too little sleep. She'd shake it off, remind herself there were no ghosts, no spirits, no anything supernatural, just a dumpy old warehouse that needed cleaning up. But the whispers never stopped. They grew louder, more desperate. Sometimes, when she stood still long enough, she could swear the voices were all around her, like they were trapped inside the walls, pressing in with cold, clammy hands. One night, the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the warehouse was plunged into near-complete darkness, save for the flickering overhead lights. Sandra was halfway through her shift, making her rounds, clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. The place felt different that night, thicker, like the air itself had weight. A low hum vibrated through the floor, almost like a heartbeat. Then, near the far corner of the warehouse, where the crates were stacked higher than a man, she saw it. A woman. Not just any woman. This one was wearing a torn, dirty white dress that hung loose and tattered, like she'd been wandering the dark for decades. She stood perfectly still, half hidden behind a stack of broken crates, her face tilted slightly toward Sandra, but her eyes, those eyes, were nothing but empty black holes, dark and unyielding. Sandra's skin crawled, a cold fire running down her spine. The air grew heavier, suffocating. The lights overhead flickered faster, casting the woman's shadow long and warped against the wall. Sandra blinked, and the woman was gone. No sound, no movement, just silence. The whispers returned, louder now, all around her, spilling from the cracks in the walls, rising from the dusty floor. "Help me! Don't leave me!" They circled her, echoing off the metal shelves, squeezing the breath from her lungs. Sandra's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She dropped the clipboard and started to back away slowly, but the shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for her with fingers she couldn't see but felt deep in her bones. That's when the warehouse seemed to change. The walls groaned like an old man waking from a long sleep. The concrete cracked underfoot, revealing dark, endless voids beneath. Shapes moved in the darkness, glimpsed only in the corner of her eye, twisted faces, pleading hands, silent screams. She tried the exit door, locked. The door she swore had always opened without a problem now held firm, as if something on the other side didn't want her to leave. Panic took over. She ran toward the office, banging on windows, screaming for help that wouldn't come. The whispers crescendoed into a howl of agony, as if the building itself was alive and mourning. Suddenly, the lights cut out completely. Total darkness. She stumbled blindly, hands outstretched, heart racing. A breathy voice, cold and desperate, whispered in her ear, "Stay with me." Her flashlight flickered on, barely illuminating the path to the emergency exit. She bolted through the door, spilling out into the cool night air. The warehouse loomed behind her, silent again, as if nothing had happened. She never returned. The warehouse stood empty, growing darker by the day, swallowing any who dared stay too late. But locals say, if you pass by on a still night, you can hear faint whispering carried on the wind, the sound of a woman trapped in a house of rust and shadows, calling for help that will never come. Sandra sometimes wakes in the middle of the night, her skin cold and clammy, hearing those same desperate whispers inside her own head. The warehouse didn't let her go, not really. And it's waiting for the next lonely soul to answer the call. Tom had always been a night owl, the kind of guy who felt more alive when the rest of the world was asleep. Working the graveyard shift at KHTX, a small Houston radio station, seemed perfect. The job was quiet, easy, and lonely in the best way. Just the hum of the equipment and his own voice floating through the speakers to empty streets and shuttered homes. Sometimes a late-night caller would break the silence, but mostly it was just static and solitude. At first, the static was nothing more than a nuisance, a background hiss that filled the gaps between songs, something every night DJ knew to ignore. But then the static began to feel different, thicker, heavier, like it was carrying something beneath the surface. A whisper, soft and chilling, slipped through the crackle. It was a woman's voice, fragile and trembling, barely more than a breath, but unmistakably human. "Tom, help me." The first time he heard it, Tom thought it was a trick of his exhaustion. He blinked at the microphone, rubbed his eyes, and laughed nervously on air, pretending nothing had happened. But the voice came back every night, steady and insistent, always the same pleading words. It wasn't in any song. It wasn't on any caller ID, just there, hidden in the white noise, like a ghost trapped inside the radio waves. Tom started losing sleep. He'd lie awake after his shifts, listening to the silence in his apartment, waiting for the voice to call him again. It never did during the day, only at night, when the world was quiet enough to hear the things no one else could. His friends told him it was stress, a product of too many late nights and too much caffeine. But Tom knew better. The voice wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, something desperate and broken, reaching out from somewhere beyond. One night, as the clock ticked past 3 a.m., the voice grew clearer. The static twisted and thinned, and the words came with sharp clarity. "Come find me. I'm waiting at 732 North Bayou. The address was unfamiliar, a place on the outskirts of Houston Tom had never heard of. The voice was no longer begging. It was commanding, urgent, impossible to ignore. After his shift, wrapped in his jacket against the humid Texas night, Tom drove out alone. The city's lights faded behind him, swallowed by miles of darkened streets and abandoned lots. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and rusted metal. At the end of a cracked road, he found the house. It was a forgotten thing, draped in shadows and decay, its windows boarded up, paint peeling like dead skin, the porch sagging under the weight of years. The silence around the house was suffocating. Tom's footsteps crunched on broken glass and dry leaves as he pushed open the rotting door. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of mold and something fouler, something like regret. The floorboards creaked beneath him, echoing in the empty rooms. Old newspapers littered the floor, yellowed and brittle. One headline caught his eye: "Local woman disappears without a trace." The article told the story of Evelyn Porter, a woman who vanished from that very neighborhood over a decade ago. No suspects, no evidence, just a hole in the fabric of time where she used to be. Tom's heart hammered as his radio, forgotten in his jacket pocket, crackled to life. The static filled the room, growing louder, swallowing his thoughts. Then the voice returned, clear and sorrowful, closer than ever. "Help me. Don't forget me." The temperature dropped suddenly. His breath puffed out in thick clouds and a coldness gripped his chest, squeezing tighter and tighter like icy fingers. Shadows seemed to gather in the corners, swirling with a life of their own. Tom wanted to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, frozen by a terror deeper than fear. He saw her then, a shape in the darkness, a woman in a torn dress, eyes empty and hollow like black pits. She reached out with translucent hands, whispering words he couldn't quite catch. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of forgotten sorrow pressing down on him like a nightmare made flesh. Tom stumbled backward, fleeing into the night. Rain pelted his face as he raced down the cracked road, heart pounding in his ears, the voice fading but never truly gone. Back at the station, the equipment was dead, screens blank, dials frozen. For days, the airwaves stayed silent and Tom refused to return. But the voice didn't stop. Long after he'd quit, long after he'd moved far from Houston, the static would find him. Late at night, when the world was still, his old radio would crackle to life on its own, that desperate whisper threading through the hiss. "Tom, help me." He's never sure if it's just the memory or something worse, the ghost in the machine, forever trapped in the static, calling out from the dark, waiting for a rescue that will never come. Carlos had worked the night shift as a delivery driver in San Antonio for nearly 5 years. The job was simple: pick up the packages, follow the routes, and deliver to the addresses. Mostly it was easy money, and the night gave him a strange kind of peace. The streets were empty, the city quiet, and the only sound was the engine humming beneath him. He liked driving at night. The calm felt almost sacred after the chaos of the day. December nights in Texas were biting cold, colder than usual that year, with the wind slicing through the open windows of his truck like a knife. Carlos wrapped his jacket tight around him as he pulled into the depot for his last run. His dispatcher handed him a package and a note, a new delivery added to his route late in the evening. It was a remote address, way out past the last stop on his usual path. The name on the slip was faded, almost smudged. M. Harper, 1234 Old Mill Road. Carlos had never heard of the place before. The address was on the outskirts of town, beyond the lights and the noise. The kind of place people talked about in hushed tones. Empty farms, forgotten houses, where the wind carried more than just leaves. But it was just another delivery, and Carlos was tired of the cold, so he climbed into his truck and headed out. The road to Old Mill was long and winding, flanked by skeletal trees that groaned in the wind. Carlos could see his breath in the frigid air, swirling like smoke as he drove deeper into the darkness. The moon was a thin crescent, barely lighting the way, and the headlights cut through the shadows like searchlights. Somewhere far off, an owl called out, lonely and mournful. After what felt like an eternity, Carlos pulled up in front of the farmhouse. It was the kind of place that had been abandoned for decades, with peeling paint and windows dark like empty eyes. The porch sagged under the weight of time, and the wind whispered through the broken shutters. Not a single light shone inside. No sign of life, except for the hollow creaks of the old wood. Carlos climbed out of the truck, the cold biting through his gloves. He looked at the package in his hands, a plain box with no return address, the label written in faded ink. He stepped onto the porch and knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the stillness, but no one answered. He waited a moment, then knocked again, harder this time. Nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Carlos could hear the wind sighing through the trees and the distant howl of a coyote, but no footsteps, no voices. He set the package down carefully on the porch, thinking maybe the resident was asleep or away. Then he turned back to his truck. As he climbed in, he glanced back through the windshield. For a brief moment, in the upper window of the farmhouse, he saw something that made his blood run cold. An old man, pale and gaunt, was standing there, watching him. The figure's eyes caught the light of the truck's headlights, deep, hollow, and impossibly sad. Carlos blinked. The figure was gone. He shook his head and pulled away, telling himself it was a trick of the shadows. But as he drove back through the empty road, he could swear the old man's eyes were following him from the dark window. The next day, curiosity gnawed at him. Carlos looked up the address at work and made a call to the number listed on the dispatcher's sheet. The voice on the other end was flat and cold, and when he asked about the house, the silence that followed was heavier than any answer. Eventually, the line went dead. Later, after his shift, Carlos drove back to Old Mill Road. The farmhouse sat just as it had the night before, silent and still. He walked to the porch where the package had been left. The box was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there at all. No marks, no disturbance, just the worn boards beneath his feet. That night, as Carlos lay in bed, the wind began to whisper through the cracks in his window. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the weather. The voice came again, soft and desperate. "Don't forget me." Sleep escaped him, and the image of the old man's hollow eyes haunted every corner of his mind. He knew something had been waiting for that package, something tied to the house and the shadows that clung to it, something that didn't want to be found, yet couldn't let go. Carlos never made that delivery again, but every time he drove past Old Mill Road, the feeling of being watched returned. The wind seemed to carry a voice, and sometimes, just sometimes, when the moon was right, he swore he could see a pale face in the window, staring out at the world like it was waiting for something it could never have.